Part 1. It started on a quiet Halloween night. My friend and I were lounging in the living room, surrounded by the chaotic remnants of a pillow fort we had built earlier that evening. We had decided to turn the night into a spooky story marathon. She had just finished telling her ghost tale, the kind that sent shivers down your spine, when it was my turn. "You want to hear something truly terrifying?" I asked, leaning forward. She smiled, waving for me to continue. "My house, there's something wrong with it." I paused, watching her expression flicker between amusement and curiosity. "It's not just old and creaky. There's something deeper." Just as I started, we heard a soft thud from the kitchen. My friend, being the skeptical one, laughed nervously. "Probably the wind," she said, but we both knew the windows were shut tight. I forced a grin, though something inside me clenched with unease. "Yeah, probably." I continued my story, recounting how strange things began when I moved into the house 6 months ago. It wasn't just the occasional creaks or groans typical of an old building, there was something more sinister beneath the surface. As I spoke, we heard it again. A louder thud. This time, we both sat frozen. "Maybe we should check it out," my friend suggested, her voice faltering slightly. Reluctantly, we ventured into the kitchen. There on the floor was the pumpkin we had placed on the counter earlier. It had fallen, split wide open, as if something heavy had crushed it. But what chilled me wasn't the pumpkin itself, it was the slow, wet sound of juice dripping from the broken shell. "No one touched it," I whispered, my throat tight. My friend shrugged, feigning bravery. "Let's clean this up. We're probably just spooking ourselves." We picked up the pieces of the pumpkin, washed our hands, and returned to the pillow fort, trying to shake off the tension. But as soon as I resumed the story, the steps started. Faint at first, like someone walking cautiously down the hallway. They grew louder, heading in our direction. Both of us sat in stunned silence, our phones clutched in hand but useless. We didn't dare call anyone, after all, what could we say? As the footsteps neared the living room, my friend whispered, "It has to be the house settling, right?" But I knew better. Part 2. The footsteps stopped right outside the living room, just beyond the pillow fort. We both stared at the doorway, barely breathing, listening to the oppressive silence that followed. My friend was pale, her earlier bravado completely gone. She motioned towards the fort as if it could somehow shield us from whatever was lurking beyond the threshold. "What do we do?" she whispered, eyes wide with fear. "Stay quiet," I muttered, barely able to get the words out. My heart was hammering in my chest. I'd lived in this house long enough to know the sounds it made, creaking pipes, wind rattling the windows, floorboards shifting. But this was different. Someone, or something, was walking through the house. We sat there, paralyzed, waiting for the next sound. Minutes dragged by like hours. My phone screen lit up with a message from my mom asking if everything was alright, but I didn't dare respond. Then, without warning, something fell in the kitchen again. This time it was louder, sharper, like glass shattering. My friend jumped up, her nerves shot. "We need to get out of here." "We can't," I said, shaking my head, "it's in the house." "What is?" "I don't know." My voice was rising, panic creeping in, "but it's not something we can just run from." Her eyes darted to the door, clearly contemplating making a break for it. I grabbed her arm before she could move. "Please, just wait." The air felt heavy around us, like the house was holding its breath. I didn't want to admit it to her, but the footsteps, the strange noises, they weren't random. They had been happening for weeks now. Always at night, always when I was alone. My friend looked like she was about to protest, but before she could say anything, the kitchen door creaked open. The sound was so deliberate, so unnatural, that it stopped us cold. We could hear the faint swish of something sliding across the floor. My heart sank. "We have to see what it is," she said, but her voice was barely audible. I shook my head, whispering, "No, we don't." But she didn't listen. She stood up, eyes fixed on the hallway. Her legs wobbled as she tiptoed toward the kitchen, leaving me behind. The light from my phone reflected off her face as she disappeared from view. I stayed in the pillow fort, too terrified to move, my pulse roaring in my ears. That's when I heard it, her scream. It was short, sharp, and immediately cut off. I leapt to my feet, dashing toward the kitchen. When I reached the doorway, my stomach dropped. The kitchen was empty. There was no sign of my friend. But on the floor, in the same spot where the pumpkin had fallen, there was something far worse. Blood. A pool of it spreading slowly across the tiles, dark and thick, leading to the back door, which was wide open. And there was no sign of her anywhere. Part 3. My legs locked up, refusing to move as I stared at the pool of blood on the kitchen floor. The back door creaked as it swayed slightly in the breeze, mocking me with its eerie rhythm. My friend was gone, and I had no idea where she could be. Forcing myself to step forward, I called her name, my voice trembling. Hannah. No answer. I edged closer to the blood, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Something was terribly wrong. I knew I should call the police, but what would I say? My friend just vanished. There's blood. The back door's open. No, it wouldn't make sense. Nothing about this made sense. I took another step. The blood led directly to the door, a trail smeared across the floor as if someone had been dragged. A cold shiver snaked down my spine. I hadn't heard any struggle, no sign of a scuffle, only her muffled scream. My mind raced, filling the gaps with horrific possibilities. Maybe she ran outside. Maybe she's hurt and hiding. The thought of leaving her out there in the dark, scared and injured, propelled me forward. Grabbing a flashlight from the counter, I stepped through the back door and into the cold, damp air. The night was eerily quiet, as if the entire world was holding its breath, waiting. I swept the beam of light across the yard. The overgrown grass swayed gently, but there was no movement, no sign of Hannah. My backyard was small, enclosed by a rotting wooden fence, and beyond that, the dense woods stretched for miles. I was about to call her name again when I noticed something that made my skin crawl. In the dirt just beyond the patio, there were deep, uneven footprints, like someone had been dragging their feet. They led toward the trees. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn back, to lock myself in the house and wait for help. But I couldn't leave her. Not like this. Hannah. I called again, but the trees swallowed my voice. No response. I took a shaky step forward, following the footprints. The flashlight flickered, and I shook it, muttering a curse. Of course, now of all times. As I entered the tree line, the air grew colder, unnaturally so. I shivered, pulling my jacket tighter around me. The flashlight illuminated twisted branches and overgrown roots that seemed to reach out, clawing at the earth like dead hands. The footprints continued, dragging deeper into the woods. But something about them seemed wrong. The further I went, the more erratic they became, as if whoever left them had been struggling, stumbling, then they stopped. Just like that, the trail ended abruptly in a small clearing, the dirt undisturbed beyond that point. No sign of a body. No sign of my friend. I spun in a slow circle, scanning the area with the flashlight. Panic tightened its grip on my chest. Hannah. Nothing. Only silence. I was about to turn back, to run as fast as I could back to the house, when the sound hit me. A soft, rhythmic tapping from behind. Tap. 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 I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It was coming from the trees behind me. Slowly, I turned the flashlight toward the noise, but the beam flickered again, casting long shadows that twisted like grotesque figures. Tap. 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 It was closer now. My hand shook so violently I could barely keep the flashlight steady. Then I saw it, a figure standing just beyond the trees, still as stone. Tall, hunched, its form cloaked in shadow, but I could make out one horrifying detail. It was holding something. Dangling from its hand, was a limp body. Hannah. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. My feet moved before I could think, and I bolted back toward the house, my legs burning as branches whipped across my face. The footsteps behind me didn't follow, but the sound, that tapping, echoed in my mind with every frantic step. Bursting through the back door, I slammed it shut and locked it, pressing my back against the cold wood, gasping for air. My vision swam, and for a moment, I thought I might pass out. The house was still, impossibly quiet. Then, from the living room, I heard a soft whisper, barely audible, like a breath carried on the wind. "Don't look." Part 4. The whisper lingered in the air, curling around me like a ghostly hand. My body trembled, every instinct screaming at me to flee, but my legs wouldn't move. I stood there, pressed against the back door, struggling to catch my breath. Had I imagined it? The soft voice, the terrible figure in the woods, Hannah's body hanging like a broken doll. "Don't look." There it was again, this time clearer, closer, as if someone were standing just behind me, their lips brushing against my ear. My skin crawled. I forced myself to turn slowly, scanning the kitchen. Empty. Dark. But that whisper had come from the living room, right where we'd been telling stories not long ago. I gripped the flashlight tighter, willing my hands to stop shaking. I didn't want to go in there. Every step felt like walking into a trap, but I couldn't stand frozen in fear forever. I took a deep breath, then another, and edged toward the living room, the faint light from the hallway casting long, crooked shadows over the walls. My mind raced with what I had seen in the woods. That figure, it wasn't human. It couldn't have been. And Hannah, she was just, gone. Taken. As I reached the doorway, my stomach twisted. The pillow fort was still there, untouched, the blankets draped over the chairs like a childhood memory turned nightmare. But something was wrong. Something was in the fort. A shape, small, hunched, was barely visible through the fabric. I could see it shifting slightly, almost imperceptibly. It was too dark to make out details, but my heart dropped into my stomach. Was it Hannah? I stepped into the living room, flashlight raised, the beam shaking as I aimed it toward the pillow fort. My mouth was dry, but I forced myself to speak. "Hannah." No response. The shape in the fort remained still, like it was waiting for something, for me. I inched forward, every muscle in my body screaming to run, to get the hell out of the house and never come back. But I had to know. I had to see if it was her. As I got closer, the air in the room seemed to thicken. There was a strange, oppressive silence, as if the house itself were holding its breath. My heart pounded in my ears as I reached out, fingers brushing the edge of the blanket draped over the chairs. I hesitated for just a second before yanking it away. The flashlight beam landed on the shape. It wasn't Hannah. It wasn't human. Curled up in the middle of the pillow fort was a grotesque, twisted figure, small, its skin pale and slick like it had just been pulled from the earth. Its arms were unnaturally long, the fingers curled and gnarled. It wasn't moving, but the eyes, God, those eyes, were wide open, staring straight at me. Hollow, black pits, bottomless and hungry. My breath caught in my throat as I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the coffee table. The thing shifted slightly, its mouth parting, revealing jagged, yellowed teeth. Then, in a voice that wasn't human, a voice like broken glass scraping against stone, it whispered again, "Don't look." I bolted. I ran, not caring where I was going, my body driven purely by terror. The hallway blurred as I sprinted toward the stairs. I had to get out, had to get away from whatever the hell that thing was. But before I could even reach the first step, something cold brushed my ankle. I screamed and looked down, the flashlight beam flailing wildly. A small, dark stain, blood, was spreading from the kitchen, crawling along the floor toward me. It wasn't just a puddle. It was moving, slithering like a living thing. Panic surged through me. I scrambled up the stairs, nearly tripping, my hand gripping the banister so hard it hurt. I ran toward my bedroom, slamming the door shut behind me, and threw myself against it. I locked it, pressing my back against the wood, gasping for breath. My pulse raced, my mind struggling to make sense of what I'd seen. That thing in the fort, the blood creeping through the house, the figure in the woods, nothing was real. It couldn't be. I had to be dreaming. But as I sat there, panting in the dark, the terror didn't fade. It only grew stronger. And then, from the other side of the door, came a soft, deliberate tap. 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 It wasn't a knock. It was the same slow, rhythmic sound I'd heard in the woods. I pressed my hands over my ears, trying to block it out, but it didn't stop. It grew louder. Tap. 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 Suddenly, the door rattled violently, as if something was trying to force its way in. I jumped to my feet, backing away, my eyes fixed on the doorknob as it slowly, deliberately began to turn. "Don't, look," the voice whispered again, from just beyond the door. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But my legs wouldn't move. Then, the doorknob stopped turning. And the voice outside said, in a low, guttural rasp, "You already did." Part 5. The words, "you already did," echoed through my head like a death sentence. My body went cold, and my mind raced as I stood there, frozen. The doorknob had stopped turning, but I could still feel something on the other side. Waiting. Watching. The house fell into a heavy silence, the kind that presses down on you, suffocating, making you feel like you're the only living thing left in the world. But I wasn't alone. I knew it. I backed away from the door, my eyes glued to the faint, shadowy outline of the knob. Whatever was outside, whatever had spoken, wasn't leaving. It wasn't going to stop. My heart thudded painfully in my chest. I needed to think, to figure out what was happening, but every thought was tangled in fear. That thing, that creature in the fort, it wasn't the source of all this. No, it was something else. Something deeper, something darker that had been lurking in my house, waiting to reveal itself. I had ignored the signs for weeks, thinking the strange noises were just the house settling, the footsteps a trick of my imagination. But they weren't. This was real, and whatever was in my home had finally decided to make its move. I glanced toward my window, briefly considering jumping out and making a run for it. It was only a one-story drop, but the thought of what might be waiting for me outside made me hesitate. That figure in the woods. I wasn't safe out there either. Suddenly, from behind the door, I heard the tapping again. But this time, it was different. Softer. Slower. It wasn't the violent, impatient rattle from before, it was deliberate. Calm. Tap. 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 I swallowed hard, stepping farther back until I hit the edge of my bed. My breathing was shallow, every nerve in my body on fire with terror. I couldn't let it in. I wouldn't let it in. But then the tapping stopped. For a moment, there was nothing, no sound, no movement. I held my breath, waiting for whatever came next. And then, the voice. That same low, rasping whisper that felt too close, too intimate. "Come, see." I shook my head, clutching the flashlight in my trembling hand. I couldn't do it. I couldn't face whatever was out there. I had seen enough. But the voice continued, like it was speaking directly into my ear, sending a chill through my entire body. "Come see what you've done." I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the words, but they burrowed into my brain, deeper and deeper. I hadn't done anything. I wasn't to blame. Was I? I stood there, paralyzed by fear and doubt. What had I unleashed? What had I allowed into my life by ignoring the warnings? The door suddenly creaked, snapping me out of my thoughts. The doorknob was slowly turning again, inch by inch. My heart leaped into my throat as I watched it twist in a slow, deliberate motion, as if mocking me, taunting me. I backed into the corner of the room, desperate for any way out, but there was none. The walls felt like they were closing in, the shadows growing longer, darker. I could hear my own ragged breathing as the door finally clicked open. It swung inward, revealing the hallway. But nothing stepped through the doorway. Nothing moved. Only the faint sound of breathing, shallow and unnatural, coming from just beyond the threshold. I held my breath, waiting for whatever was lurking out there to show itself. Then something moved, a shadow sliding along the floor like smoke, creeping toward the bed. My eyes widened as the shape began to take form. It wasn't the creature from the fort, nor was it the figure from the woods. This was something else entirely. Taller, darker, its body seemed to bend and twist unnaturally, like a shadow with a will of its own. It stopped just at the edge of the bed, standing there, looming over me. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, my back pressed against the cold wall. The thing leaned forward, its face, a grotesque, featureless void, hovering just inches from mine. I could feel the chill radiating from it, seeping into my skin, my bones. And then, it spoke again, its voice low and echoing, as if coming from some distant, hellish place. "You let me in." I shook my head violently, tears stinging my eyes. "No, I didn't. I didn't let you in." But it didn't respond. It didn't need to. Because deep down, I knew it was right. I had ignored the warnings. I had looked when I wasn't supposed to. And now it was here. The figure didn't move. It didn't need to. Its presence alone was enough to make me feel like my mind was unraveling. I wanted to close my eyes, to shut it out, but something stopped me, some small part of me that still clung to the belief that if I faced it, if I confronted it, maybe I could end this nightmare. But what I saw next made me regret that decision instantly. From the darkness within its void of a face, something began to emerge, slowly, deliberately. A hand. A hand that was holding something. A head. Hannah's head. Her lifeless eyes stared back at me, her mouth twisted in a grotesque grin, her hair matted with blood. The thing held her head out toward me, as if offering it like a gift. A prize. I screamed. But no sound came out. Only silence. Part 6. The world around me seemed to fall away as I stood frozen in front of the thing, my mind teetering on the edge of complete collapse. I couldn't tear my eyes away from Hannah's severed head, her glassy, vacant stare drilling into my soul. The grotesque grin on her face, twisted in a way that no human expression should be, sent a wave of nausea crashing through me. I wanted to scream. To run. But I couldn't move. My legs were locked, my throat tight and dry, and all I could do was stand there, trembling, while the thing held out Hannah's head like it was showing me some grotesque treasure. Then, it moved. The thing's shadowy form shifted, its limbs bending and twisting in ways that defied reason. It stepped closer, the hand clutching Hannah's head lowering slowly. It tilted its faceless void toward me, and in that moment, I felt an icy tendril of something dark and malevolent reaching into me, into my mind, my thoughts. "You wanted to know," it whispered, the voice low and raspy, like a distant echo carried on a cold wind. "Now you see." I shook my head, a tear slipping down my cheek. I didn't. I never. But the thing didn't care. It leaned closer still, its form flickering like a dying flame, shifting in and out of focus. It wasn't bound by the same rules as the rest of us. This thing was beyond anything I could comprehend. And it was inside my home. It had wormed its way in through every crack, every dark corner, and I had invited it without even realizing. It dropped Hannah's head. The wet, sickening thud as it hit the floor echoed in the silence, and my stomach lurched. I pressed myself further against the wall, desperate to create some space between me and the nightmare standing before me. Then, without warning, it whispered again. "She's not the first." My blood ran cold. What do you mean?" The thing straightened, its long, twisted limbs twitching unnervingly. "This place," it hissed, "is mine. Always has been." I stared at it, my mind racing, but the words didn't fully register. Always has been. What did that mean? My house was just an old, run-down place I'd found at a bargain. I'd been living here for 6 months, and before that, it had been abandoned for years. There were rumors, of course, but I never believed in that sort of thing. "Countless before you," it continued, its voice sending shivers down my spine. "They looked, too. They all looked. And now they belong to me." I wanted to protest, to argue, to tell it that I wasn't like the others, that I didn't want to look, that I hadn't meant to break the rules. But deep down, I knew it didn't matter. The rules weren't made to protect me from it. They were made to contain it. The thing slowly reached out one of its long, clawed hands and pointed to the corner of the room. My heart nearly stopped as I followed its gesture, my eyes landing on something I hadn't noticed before, something that sent a fresh wave of horror coursing through me. The walls. The wallpaper. It wasn't just peeling. Faces. Dozens of them. Hundreds, maybe. Faint outlines pressed into the walls, mouths agape in silent screams, their eyes wide with terror. The longer I stared, the clearer they became, ghostly imprints of people who had been here before, their souls trapped within the very fabric of the house. They were everywhere. All around me, their hollow, empty eyes watching. Pleading. "You see them now," the thing whispered, its voice thick with satisfaction. They looked, too. I stumbled backward, away from the walls, my heart hammering in my chest. "No," I muttered, shaking my head in disbelief. "No, this isn't real. It can't be." But it was real. The faces, those souls, they had all been here, living in this house just like I was now. And they had all made the same mistake. They had looked. The thing stepped forward, its grotesque form towering over me. "You belong to me now," it whispered, its breath cold and foul as it washed over my skin. "Just like the rest." I tried to scream, but my voice was gone, lost in the sea of terror that had engulfed me. The room felt like it was spinning, the faces on the walls growing more defined, more desperate, as if they knew what was coming next. I had to get out. I had to escape before it was too late. Gathering every ounce of strength I had left, I bolted. I didn't think, didn't hesitate. I just ran, bursting out of the bedroom and down the stairs, my feet barely touching the steps as I flew toward the front door. My hand fumbled for the lock, and for a split second, I thought I wouldn't make it, that the thing would reach me, that it would drag me back. But the door flew open, and I stumbled outside into the freezing night air, collapsing onto the cold, damp grass. I gasped for breath, my entire body shaking uncontrollably. For a moment, I just lay there, staring up at the dark sky, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I was free. But something wasn't right. I could still feel it. I slowly sat up, my breath catching in my throat as I looked back toward the house. The front door was still wide open, but the thing wasn't there. There was no shadow, no figure lurking in the doorway. But I wasn't alone. There, standing just a few feet away from me, was a figure. Tall. Motionless. It wasn't the thing from the house. It was me. A twisted, hollow version of me, standing in the dark, staring at me with those same bottomless, empty eyes I had seen in the pillow fort. My reflection, or something pretending to be me, stood there, its head tilting slightly as if studying me. And then it smiled. A slow, deliberate smile that stretched too wide, too far, splitting its face in two. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The thing in the house hadn't just claimed the souls of those who looked. It had replaced them. Part 7. The sight of my twisted reflection, standing there in the cold night, smiling that grotesque, unnatural smile, sent a shockwave of terror through my body. It wasn't just like me, it was me, in some horrible, distorted way. My mind couldn't comprehend it, couldn't piece together how something so wrong could look so much like me, yet feel so hollow. It took a step forward, that eerie smile still stretched across its face. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to run, but my legs were frozen, useless beneath me. I wanted to move, to get as far away from it as possible, but I was paralyzed by the horror of what I was seeing. You don't belong here," I stammered, though the words felt weak, meaningless in the face of what I was witnessing. The thing tilted its head further, like it was amused, like it enjoyed my fear. Its eyes, those bottomless black voids, bore into me, stripping away any sense of safety, any illusion that I could escape. And then, it spoke. "You're too late," it whispered, the voice soft but echoing, like it was coming from every shadow, every dark corner of the night. "You let me in." I shook my head violently, my body trembling uncontrollably. No, I didn't. I didn't let you in." My voice cracked, barely above a whisper, and I realized how pathetic it sounded, how small I felt in the presence of this thing. It smiled wider. "Look," it said, taking another step closer, its voice dripping with cold malice. "Look what you've done." Against every instinct, I glanced back at the house. My heart lurched. The front door was still open, but what lay beyond it wasn't the familiar interior of my home. The hallway, the living room, it was all gone, replaced by a twisted, decaying version of itself. The walls were dark, covered in shadowy figures, the faces pressed against them, dozens of them, seemed more alive now, more real, their mouths open in silent, endless screams. The light inside flickered, casting warped shadows that seemed to move on their own. And in the center of it all, it stood. The original figure, the one I had seen in the woods and later in my room, was there, hunched and grotesque, its long, twisted limbs barely visible in the dim light. It was staring at me with that featureless void where its face should be, its body twitching unnaturally as if it was struggling to contain itself. I felt like I was being pulled back toward the house, like the air itself was dragging me closer to the darkness. I could feel the weight of all those trapped souls pressing down on me, suffocating me. "This is your fault," the reflection whispered again, stepping closer still. "You looked. And now you belong to me." "No." I screamed, finding a burst of strength as I scrambled to my feet, my body finally obeying the primal urge to survive. I staggered backward, my gaze darting between the thing in front of me and the nightmare scene unfolding in the house behind me. But it didn't stop. It kept coming, slow and deliberate, every step bringing it closer. The air around me grew colder, denser, like the very night was closing in, suffocating me. My back hit something solid. I glanced behind me, realizing too late that I had backed up against the old wooden fence at the edge of the yard. There was nowhere left to go. I could feel the weight of its presence pressing down on me as it came closer, that twisted version of myself staring with those black, endless eyes. The house loomed in the background, pulsing with shadows, like it was alive, like it was breathing. The thing reached out a hand, its long fingers curling toward me, inches away from my face. I could feel the cold radiating off of it, seeping into my skin, my bones. It wasn't just going to kill me. It was going to take me. I shut my eyes, bracing for the end, when suddenly, it stopped. I opened my eyes, cautiously, blinking in disbelief. The figure had frozen in place, its hands still outstretched but not moving. It stood there, motionless, as if something had interrupted its advance. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe, but I could feel something shift in the air around me, something different. And then I heard it. A sound. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, echoing from behind me. I spun around, expecting to see another figure, another nightmare emerging from the shadows. But what I saw stopped my heart. Hannah. She stood just a few feet away, her clothes stained with dirt, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear, but she was alive. Her body trembled, her lips slightly parted, as if she was just as shocked to see me as I was to see her. Hannah? I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't respond at first. Her gaze was fixed on the thing behind me, her expression one of pure terror. Slowly, she shook her head, her voice trembling when she finally spoke. "It's not real," she whispered, her voice so soft I almost didn't hear it. "None of this is real." I turned back toward the figure that had been pursuing me, but it was gone. The twisted version of myself had vanished, the air where it had stood now empty, cold. The house still loomed in the background, but the grotesque, decaying vision I had seen was starting to blur, to dissolve like mist in the morning light. What do you mean?" I asked, my mind racing. Hannah's gaze flickered toward the house, then back to me. "It's the house," she said, her voice shaky but insistent. "It's been in your head, this whole time. It's been feeding off of your fear." I blinked, trying to process what she was saying. "Feeding off of me? But you." I saw. She shook her head again. "That wasn't me. It was never me." My heart pounded as her words sank in. The house, it had been warping everything, twisting reality, making me see things that weren't there. Making me believe that the nightmare was real. But if none of it was real, then what the hell had I been running from? Before I could ask, Hannah's expression changed. Her eyes darted back to the house, and her face paled even more. "We have to go," she whispered, taking a step backward. "Now. Before it finds another way in." I didn't need to be told twice. Without looking back, we bolted. Part 8. We ran, our feet pounding against the cold, damp earth, every breath sharp and ragged in the chilling night air. The house, my house, loomed behind us, growing smaller in the distance, but the terror of what we had just escaped clung to us like a shadow. Hannah led the way, weaving through the narrow streets, her eyes wide with fear. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that twisted version of myself or the shadowy figure from the woods chasing us. But the street was empty, the only sound the frantic rhythm of our footsteps. "Hannah," I gasped, struggling to keep up. How did you get out?" "I thought you were." "I didn't get out," she said without stopping or turning to look at me. "I was never in there." "What do you mean?" Her pace quickened, her voice tight. "The house, it messes with your head. It makes you see things, believe things that aren't real. It feeds off your fear, warps everything. The longer you're in there, the more it controls you." I felt a cold shiver run through me. I had spent months in that house. How long had it been twisting my reality? How much of what I had experienced was a lie? "I don't understand," I said, nearly tripping over a crack in the sidewalk. "If none of it was real, then what about the blood? What about that thing I saw? And you, I saw you." "I know," Hannah said, her voice trembling. "It makes you see what it wants you to see. It wants you to believe. That's how it traps you." Her words made my head spin. Everything I had witnessed, the footsteps, the creature, Hannah's severed head, had it all been some kind of sick hallucination? A nightmare woven by the house itself? But it felt real. Too real. We finally stopped running when we reached the edge of the neighborhood. The streetlights cast long, flickering shadows over the empty road, and I doubled over, trying to catch my breath. Hannah leaned against a tree, her eyes scanning the area as if she expected something to leap out from the darkness. "We need to get as far from here as possible," she said, her voice low. "That house, it won't let you go easily." I looked back in the direction we'd come, my heart still racing. The house was barely visible now, hidden behind a row of trees and other homes. But even from this distance, I could feel its presence, like it was watching, waiting. "Why me?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "Why did it choose me?" Hannah's expression softened, but there was a deep sadness in her eyes. "It didn't choose you," she said quietly. "It's been there for years, waiting for someone to come along. You just moved in." I swallowed hard, the weight of her words pressing down on me. I thought back to the first night I'd spent in the house, how the air had felt heavy, how the shadows had seemed too dark, too still. I had brushed it all off as just nerves, as the quirks of an old house. But the truth was far more sinister. "How do you know all this?" I asked, glancing at her. Hannah's gaze dropped, her fingers nervously picking at the edge of her sleeve. "Because it almost got me too. A few years ago, before I moved out of town. I had a friend who, well, she wasn't as lucky." My heart sank. "What happened?" Hannah's eyes flickered with pain. "She didn't leave when she should have. She stayed. She looked. And she never came back." A cold, sinking feeling settled in my gut. The faces in the walls, the way the house seemed to breathe, they were all people, people like me, like Hannah's friend. The house had taken them, twisted them into something else. It fed off them, trapping them in an endless nightmare. "We can't let it do the same to you," she said firmly, her voice shaking with determination. I nodded, though fear still gnawed at me. "What do we do?" Hannah hesitated for a moment, her eyes darting to the dark woods that loomed beyond the street. "There's one place we can go. One place the house can't reach us." I frowned. "Where?" "The old cemetery," she said quietly, as if the very words were a secret. I felt my stomach drop. The cemetery was a few miles outside of town, abandoned and overgrown, the kind of place everyone avoided after dark. I had only been there once, years ago, during some stupid dare in high school, and even then, it had felt wrong. But if Hannah believed it was safe, I had no choice but to trust her. "Why there?" I asked, still catching my breath. "Because it's hallowed ground," she explained. "The house, whatever it is, it can't cross into places that are sacred. It loses its power." A chill ran down my spine. It sounded like something out of an old horror movie, but after everything I'd seen tonight, I was ready to believe anything. I took a deep breath and nodded. "Okay, let's go." We started walking again, our pace slower but determined. The road stretched out before us, winding through the dark, silent woods. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the house, or something worse, following us. But the only sound was the crunch of our footsteps on the gravel. The farther we got from the house, the more the air seemed to clear, like a heavy weight was being lifted off my chest. I could finally breathe again, the suffocating presence of the house fading into the background. But it wasn't gone. I could still feel it, lurking in the back of my mind, like a shadow that never fully disappears. As we approached the cemetery, the tall, rusted gates came into view, twisted and overgrown with vines. The moonlight barely penetrated the thick canopy of trees, casting long, eerie shadows across the ground. I hesitated for a moment, staring at the gate, my heart pounding in my chest. Hannah glanced at me. "This is the only place it can't touch us." I nodded, swallowing my fear, and stepped through the gate. The cemetery was a maze of crumbling tombstones, overgrown with ivy and forgotten by time. The air was still, almost too quiet, as if the world was holding its breath. We walked in silence, the weight of everything pressing down on us. "Here," Hannah said suddenly, stopping in front of an old stone mausoleum. The entrance was sealed shut, but there was something about the place that felt different. Safe, even. She knelt down, placing her hand on the cold stone. "We'll be safe here. The house won't follow us." I sat down beside her, my mind still racing with questions. "How long do we have to stay?" Hannah looked at me, her face pale but calm. "Just until morning. Once the sun comes up, its power fades." I nodded, hugging my knees to my chest, trying to ignore the cold creeping through my bones. But even as we sat there in the cemetery, far from the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Not yet. Because the house, it had let us leave. And I had a sinking feeling that it wasn't done with me. Not by a long shot. Part 9. As we sat huddled in front of the mausoleum, the oppressive silence of the cemetery wrapped around us like a shroud. The wind barely stirred the overgrown grass, and even the air seemed hesitant to move, as if the very ground we were sitting on held its breath. I kept glancing over at Hannah, waiting for her to say something, anything, that might make me feel like we were truly safe here. But deep down, I knew better. The cold stone of the mausoleum pressed against my back as I rested my head on my knees, trying to still the panic swirling in my chest. My mind kept drifting back to the house, the way it had twisted everything around me, made me doubt my own senses. The faces in the walls. The thing that had pretended to be me. And worst of all, the way it had let us leave without a fight, like it was toying with us, letting us believe we'd escaped when the nightmare was just beginning. Hannah's voice broke the silence. "Do you hear that?" I froze, straining my ears, but at first I didn't hear anything. Just the wind rustling the leaves in the distance and the faint creak of old tree branches swaying under the weight of time. But then, faint and far away, there was a sound. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but unmistakable. A low, distant hum. No, not a hum. A vibration. It was coming from beneath the earth, like something was moving, shifting beneath the surface. My skin prickled with cold sweat. What is that?" Hannah shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. "I don't know. But we need to stay close to the mausoleum. It's the only thing keeping us safe." She said it with certainty, but I could tell she wasn't sure. There was something in the air now, something I couldn't quite explain. It felt like the cemetery itself was waking up, like it was watching us, waiting. The ground beneath me felt colder, harder. That strange vibration continued, faint but persistent, like something stirring in its sleep. I looked up at the sky, hoping for any sign of the approaching dawn, but the moon hung there, indifferent, and the horizon remained dark. Hours to go before morning. "Maybe it's just the wind," I whispered, trying to convince myself as much as her. But Hannah shook her head again, her face tense. "It's not the wind. It's the house. It's reaching." I felt my stomach drop. "But, it can't come here, right? You said it couldn't cross into sacred ground." Hannah stood up, glancing nervously at the surrounding graves, her fingers trembling. "It can't. Not physically. But it's trying to find us. It's looking for a way." The mausoleum's presence, once comforting, now felt fragile, like an old, crumbling wall barely keeping out the storm beyond. The weight of the house, its hunger, seemed to press against the air, growing stronger by the second. I got to my feet, unable to sit still any longer, my pulse racing in my throat. How do we stop it? How do we keep it from getting to us? Hannah's eyes darted around the cemetery, as if she was searching for an answer hidden among the gravestones. "We need to stay here. It's not strong enough to come through on its own, not as long as we're on this ground." I could hear the desperation in her voice. She didn't have a plan. She was as lost as I was. A sharp gust of wind swept through the cemetery, rattling the old iron gate at the entrance. The trees swayed, their branches creaking, casting jagged shadows across the cracked headstones. The vibration beneath the earth grew stronger. Louder. Something was coming. "Hannah," I whispered, barely able to control the trembling in my voice, "if it can't come here, what is it doing?" She didn't answer. Her eyes were locked on something in the distance, and I followed her gaze toward the far edge of the cemetery. At first, I couldn't see anything. Just the same tombstones and trees shrouded in darkness. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A figure. No, not just one. Several. Moving slowly, almost gliding, toward us. "What the hell?" I gasped, taking a step back, my eyes widening in horror. The figures moved with eerie, unnatural grace, their forms shrouded in shadow. I could barely make out their faces, but I knew instantly what they were. I had seen them before, pressed into the walls of my house, their faces twisted in terror. They were the lost souls. The ones who had looked. And they were coming for us. Hannah grabbed my arm, her voice trembling. "It's them. The house is sending them. It's using them to find us." I took a step back, my heart slamming against my chest as the figures drew closer. Their eyes, those hollow, empty pits, seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight, and their mouths hung open, as if silently screaming. They weren't fast, but they were relentless, gliding over the ground with impossible precision. "We have to go," I cried, pulling at Hannah's arm. "We can't stay here." Hannah shook her head violently. "No. If we leave the cemetery, the house will get us. We have to stay." "But they're coming," I shouted, panic rising in my throat. Part 10. "They're coming," I shouted, gripping Hannah's arm tighter, my voice rising in sheer panic. The figures were closing in, their twisted forms gliding through the dark like shadows ripped from another world. My mind was racing, screaming for me to run, but Hannah held her ground. "We can't leave the cemetery," she yelled, her eyes wild with fear. "If we do, the house will take us, for good." I looked back at the mausoleum, its cold stone walls offering little comfort now. The creeping sensation of doom pressed in from all sides. We were trapped. Trapped between the souls that the house had consumed and the house itself, waiting just beyond the cemetery's borders, watching, pulling at us. "Hannah, we need to move," I gasped, my throat dry and tight. "We can't just wait for them to reach us." She hesitated, her face twisted in uncertainty, but I could see it in her eyes. She didn't have a better plan. The sacred ground might have kept the house out, but it wasn't stopping these things from coming. They weren't bound by the same rules. And now, they were nearly upon us. One of the figures was closer than the others, its hollow eyes locked on me. Its face was warped, stretched unnaturally, as if it had once been human but had long since forgotten how. Its mouth opened and closed silently, as if trying to speak, but no sound came. Just the empty, soul-crushing silence. I stumbled backward, pulling Hannah with me. "We need to get to the other side of the cemetery." "Maybe we can." The closest figure reached out, its hand stretching toward me, its long, bony fingers twitching. I dodged to the side, barely avoiding its grasp, but the movement knocked me off balance, and I fell hard to the ground, my back slamming against the cold earth. Hannah screamed my name, grabbing at me, but my eyes were fixed on the figure above me. It loomed over me now, its fingers inches from my face, the cold, dead air around it suffocating. I could feel its hunger, its desperation to pull me into whatever dark place it had come from. Just as the thing reached for me again, a sharp gust of wind swept through the cemetery, scattering leaves and dirt into the air. The figure froze for a moment, its empty eyes narrowing, and in that split second, I felt something change. The air shifted, the pressure lifting slightly. "Hannah!" I gasped, pulling myself up. The wind, it's pushing them back. She looked at me, wide-eyed. What? I didn't fully understand it myself, but I could feel it, the gust of wind, like a force pushing against the figures, slowing their advance. The house might have sent them, but the cemetery itself seemed to be fighting back. We have to keep moving, I urged, grabbing her arm. Get to the far side, where the wind is strongest. Hannah nodded, her face still pale but filled with a new sense of urgency. Together, we ran, the cold wind whipping around us, kicking up dust and leaves as we darted between the old tombstones. I could hear the figures behind us, their movements slow but relentless, their hollow eyes still locked on us. The wind grew stronger the farther we went, as if the cemetery was trying to protect us, trying to shield us from the horrors that pursued. But the figures didn't stop. They couldn't. The house had sent them, and they would keep coming until it got what it wanted. The mausoleum was far behind us now, and the edge of the cemetery was in sight, a crumbling stone wall that separated the old, forgotten graves from the wilderness beyond. The wind howled, swirling around us as we reached the wall, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. We can't stay here, Hannah said, her voice shaking. They'll keep coming. I looked back at the shadowy figures moving slowly but steadily through the cemetery, their ghostly forms illuminated by the faint moonlight. They were still far enough away, but I knew it wouldn't be long before they reached us. The wind was only delaying the inevitable. But something caught my eye. Beyond the wall, through the thick trees and underbrush, there was movement, something else, something lurking in the woods. At first, I thought it might be more of the house's creatures, but then I realized it was something else. The trees seemed to bend slightly, the shadows shifting unnaturally. Hannah noticed it too, her eyes narrowing as she watched the woods. What is that? I don't know, I whispered, my voice barely audible over the wind. But I don't think it's from the house. The figures behind us were closing in, and I knew we had no other choice. We couldn't stay in the cemetery, and we couldn't go back. Whatever was out there, in the woods, might be our only chance. Hannah, I said, my voice firm. We need to go into the forest. She stared at me like I'd lost my mind. Into the forest? Are you insane? We don't even know what's out there. I didn't have time to argue. The shadowy figures were closer now, their ghostly hands reaching out, their mouths still moving in silent screams. The wind wasn't going to hold them back forever. We don't have a choice. I shouted, grabbing her hand and pulling her toward the crumbling wall. It's the only way. She hesitated for a second longer, her face twisted in fear, but then she nodded. Together, we scrambled over the wall, tumbling into the thick brush on the other side. The forest was dark, dense, and suffocating. The trees loomed over us like towering giants, their branches twisted and gnarled, forming a canopy that blocked out most of the moonlight. But the wind still howled, cutting through the trees like a sharp blade. We pushed forward, weaving through the underbrush, our hearts racing, the sound of our footsteps barely audible over the wind. I could still feel the presence of the house, but it was fading, like it was losing its grip on us the farther we went. But just as I started to feel a sliver of hope, something else emerged from the shadows. A figure. Not one of the ghostly ones from the house, but something different. It was tall, unnaturally tall, its limbs long and spindly, its face hidden in shadow. It stood in the middle of the path, blocking our way. My heart sank. Hannah grabbed my arm, pulling me to a stop. What is that? The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching us, its presence filling the air with a deep, suffocating dread. And then, without warning, it spoke. You shouldn't have come here. Its voice was low, deep, echoing through the trees like a distant thunderclap. Hannah and I froze, our eyes locked on the towering figure. We're trying to escape, I said, my voice barely a whisper. The house, it's after us. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if considering my words. "You're running from one nightmare," it said, its voice rumbling like the earth itself, "but you've stumbled into another." My heart pounded in my chest, the cold grip of terror tightening around me. I glanced at Hannah, but her face was pale, her body trembling. We just need to get away," I stammered, my voice shaking. "Please." The figure took a step forward, its movements slow and deliberate. "There is no escape," it said, its voice dark and final. "Not from this. Not from what's coming." "What do you mean?" I asked, my throat dry. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it lifted one long, bony finger and pointed back toward the cemetery, where the wind had suddenly stopped. And from the silence, I heard it again. The tapping. Tap. 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 Part 11. The tapping echoed through the dark forest, sharp and rhythmic, like a clock ticking down to something terrible. Tap. 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 Each sound reverberated through the trees, sending a fresh wave of terror crawling up my spine. I turned toward the source, and even through the dense shadows, I could see it. Figures were moving again, those figures, the ones from the house. They were coming through the cemetery wall now, their twisted bodies gliding soundlessly toward us. Their hollow eyes locked onto us, and their mouths hung open in those silent, eternal screams. The wind that had protected us earlier was gone, replaced by an unnatural stillness that clung to the air like death. The tall figure in front of us hadn't moved. It stood there, unmoving, watching, its shadow stretching unnaturally in the moonlight. Its voice returned, deep and rumbling like thunder. "The house has found you. It will not stop." I backed up, pulling Hannah with me, my pulse racing. What do we do?" I whispered, my voice breaking. "Please, tell us what to do." The figure tilted its head slightly, like it was contemplating us, deciding whether or not to answer. When it finally spoke, its voice was like gravel, rough and cold. "You can run, but you cannot hide. Once the house has claimed you, it does not let go." "No," I gasped, shaking my head violently. "That can't be true. There has to be a way out. There has to be." The figure remained still, its dark presence towering over us like a shadow of death. Its bony finger pointed once again, this time deeper into the forest. "There is only one way out. You must face what you have unleashed." Hannah's grip on my arm tightened, her voice barely above a whisper. "What does it mean?" "Face what?" I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. The house, the visions, the twisted reflections, they had all been part of something darker, something that had been waiting for me. For us. The figure took a slow step forward, its presence thickening the air around us. "What you saw, what you touched, was just the beginning." I could barely breathe. My mind raced back to the night in the house, the strange thud, the pumpkin shattering on the floor, the footsteps, the grotesque creature in the pillow fort, and finally the twisted version of myself. I had looked. I had broken the rule. And now the house was coming for me. "What do we do?" Hannah asked, her voice trembling with fear. "How do we stop it?" The figure's eyes, black and empty, seemed to pierce through us. "You must return to where it began," it said. "To the house." I stared at the figure in disbelief. "Return? Go back to the house?" The thought of stepping foot in that place again made my skin crawl. Every instinct screamed against it, but deep down, I knew the figure was right. Whatever had been unleashed was tied to the house, and the only way to stop it was to confront it. "We can't," I muttered, shaking my head. "We barely got out alive." The figure remained silent, but its cold, unwavering stare told me everything I needed to know. There was no other way. We couldn't outrun it, and we couldn't hide. It would find us, no matter where we went. "We have to go back," I said quietly, turning to Hannah. She looked at me like I had just suggested jumping into a pit of snakes, but I could see the same grim realization in her eyes. She nodded, her voice shaky. Okay. If that's the only way. I glanced back toward the figures slowly approaching us from the cemetery, their bodies moving in that eerie, deliberate glide. They were getting closer, their hollow eyes gleaming in the dark. We didn't have much time. I turned to the tall figure. Will you help us? For a long moment, it didn't respond. Then, slowly, it raised one long, spindly finger and pointed back toward the way we had come, from the cemetery, back toward the house. No one can help you now, it whispered. You must face it alone. My heart sank, but I nodded. There was no other choice. Hannah and I started running again, pushing through the dense trees, our breaths ragged as we stumbled through the dark forest. The tall figure faded into the shadows behind us, and the tapping, the dreadful tap, 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 followed us, growing louder with each passing second. My legs burned, my lungs screamed for air, but we couldn't stop. Not yet. We broke through the tree line, and there it was, standing at the end of the road like a dark sentinel. The house. Its windows stared back at us like hollow eyes, and the front door stood slightly ajar, as if waiting, welcoming us back into the nightmare. I stopped, my entire body trembling with fear. My chest rose and fell in quick, shallow breaths, and every fiber of my being told me to turn around, to run as far away from that place as possible. But there was no running. Not anymore. Hannah stood beside me, her face pale, her lips quivering. I can't do it, she whispered. I can't go back in there. I wanted to tell her she didn't have to, that we could find another way, but I knew that wasn't true. The house had already marked us, and until we ended this, it wouldn't stop. We have to, I said, my voice barely audible. Hannah nodded, but I could see the terror in her eyes. We took a few hesitant steps toward the house, the old wooden boards creaking underfoot. The air was thick, heavy with the stench of rot and decay, and the closer we got to the door, the colder it became. I pushed the door open with trembling hands, and it groaned on its hinges, revealing the dark, suffocating interior. Everything looked just as I had left it, like a perfectly preserved nightmare. The air inside was still, but it wasn't empty. I could feel it watching us, waiting. Where do we go? Hannah whispered, her voice barely audible. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. To the source, I said. We need to find whatever is controlling this place. We stepped into the house, the door closing behind us with a soft click, sealing us in. The oppressive weight of the house fell over us immediately, and I could hear faint whispers, like voices in the walls, calling out from the dark. The stairs loomed before us, leading up into the shadows. And from above, I heard it again, the unmistakable tap, tap, tap. It was waiting for us. We go up, I said, though every word felt like lead in my mouth. Hannah's hand found mine, and together, we climbed the stairs, each step bringing us closer to the heart of the nightmare. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. As we reached the top of the stairs, a long, dark hallway stretched before us. At the end of it, the door to the master bedroom stood open, just a crack. And from inside, I heard a voice. Familiar. Twisted. You already looked. Now see what you've done. I gripped Hannah's hand tighter. We stepped forward. Part 12. The hallway stretched out before us like a dark tunnel, the walls pressing in from both sides, suffocating, as if the house itself was alive and drawing us deeper into its heart. The whispers that had been faint before now rose in intensity, overlapping voices murmuring from behind the walls, from beneath the floorboards. The tapping, constant and rhythmic, echoed down the hallway. Tap. 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 The door at the end of the hall was barely open, just a crack, but I could feel the pull from inside. Something was waiting for us in that room. Whatever had twisted this house into a living nightmare, whatever had corrupted it, was behind that door. I glanced at Hannah. Her face was pale, her lips trembling, but she nodded at me, her eyes filled with fear and resolve. There was no turning back now. With a deep breath, we took the first step down the hallway. Each step felt like walking deeper into a grave. The air grew colder with every inch we moved closer to the door, so cold I could see my breath misting in the dim light. The walls seemed to pulse, the shadows shifting as if they were alive, slithering along the floor and ceiling. I could feel the house watching us, its presence heavy, waiting. "Do you hear that?" Hannah whispered, her voice barely audible over the tapping. I strained to listen, and beneath the constant tap, 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 there was something else. Faint, almost too quiet to make out at first, but unmistakable, a low, guttural whisper. "Come closer." I stopped in my tracks, my body trembling. That voice, it was coming from behind the door, from inside the room. It wasn't a voice like the others. This one was different. It was deeper, darker. It felt ancient, like it had been here long before the house, long before any of us. It was waiting for us to open the door. "We have to keep going," I whispered, though the words felt like ashes in my mouth. My feet felt heavy, like they were sinking into the floor with every step, but I forced myself forward, dragging Hannah along with me. The door was just a few feet away now. The tapping was louder than ever, pounding in my ears, vibrating through my skull. Tap. 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 I reached out with a shaking hand and grasped the doorknob. It was ice cold, colder than anything I'd ever felt before. For a moment, I hesitated, every instinct in my body screaming at me to run, to turn back before it was too late. But I knew there was no escaping this. Not anymore. I pushed the door open. The room inside was dark, but not the kind of darkness you can escape with light. It was a thick, living darkness, swallowing everything in its path. The shadows were heavy, oppressive, curling around the furniture, the walls, and the floor like smoke. The air inside the room was colder than the hallway, and it carried the stench of rot and decay, thick and choking. But it wasn't the cold or the smell that made my heart stop. It was what I saw in the center of the room. A figure. It was sitting on the floor, hunched over, its long, bony arms stretched out in front of it. Its head was bowed low, and its back was hunched, like it was cradling something in its hands. Its body was twisted and grotesque, its skin as pale as bone, and it looked as though it had been there for centuries. The tapping had stopped. For a long moment, there was only silence, the heavy, suffocating kind that presses down on you until you feel like you're going to suffocate. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Then, slowly, the figure lifted its head. My stomach dropped. It was me. A twisted, hollow version of me, its face pale and gaunt, its eyes black and empty like the void. Its lips curled into a grotesque smile, too wide, stretching unnaturally across its face. It stared at me, its eyes locked onto mine, and the longer I looked, the more I felt the life drain from my body. "You shouldn't have looked." The voice came from the thing on the floor, my voice, but distorted, broken. It was a mockery of myself, the house's twisted version of me, and it was waiting. In its hands, I saw what it was cradling. A small, broken mirror. The reflection inside wasn't of the room or the walls around us, it was of me. But not the me that was standing there. It was the me I had been before all of this started. Before I looked, before the house took hold of me. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. What is this? The twisted reflection of me grinned wider, its teeth sharp and jagged, the skin on its face stretched impossibly tight. "You wanted to know," it hissed. "You wanted to see. Now you will." Before I could react, the thing lunged toward me, its arms outstretched. I stumbled backward, crashing into Hannah, and we both fell to the floor. The twisted version of myself moved faster than I thought possible, its long, spindly fingers reaching for my face, for my eyes. Hannah screamed, scrambling to her feet. Run! But I couldn't move. I couldn't take my eyes off the creature, off the hollow, empty blackness in its gaze. It was like staring into a bottomless pit, a void that would swallow me whole. My body felt paralyzed, trapped in the gaze of my own twisted reflection. The thing's cold, bony fingers grazed my cheek, and I felt a wave of icy terror wash over me, freezing me in place. The air around me thickened, like the very walls were closing in, crushing the life out of me. Just as its fingers wrapped around my throat, Hannah grabbed me, yanking me backward with all her strength. The thing's grip slipped, and I fell hard onto the wooden floor, gasping for breath. We have to go. Hannah shouted, dragging me toward the door. The twisted reflection screamed, a sound so guttural and inhuman it made my ears ring. I looked back in horror as the creature writhed on the floor, its limbs twisting and contorting unnaturally, its mouth gaping open wider and wider, stretching until it seemed like it would tear itself apart. But we didn't wait to see what happened next. Hannah pulled me to my feet, and we bolted for the door, stumbling down the stairs as fast as we could. The house groaned around us, the walls shaking violently as if the entire building was coming alive, trying to trap us inside. I could hear the whispers again, louder now, angry, desperate. We burst through the front door, the cold night air hitting me like a slap to the face. The sky was starting to lighten, the faint glow of dawn creeping over the horizon. But even as we ran from the house, I could feel it wasn't done with us. Not yet. Behind us, the house loomed, dark and terrible, its windows staring down at us like hungry eyes. And somewhere deep inside, I knew that this wasn't over. That even though we had escaped, the house would always be there. Waiting. Because once you look, once you see what's inside, you never truly leave.